So here we are at the end of our little ball of twine and the conclusion of our very brief time together looking at polity and ethical leadership in the United Church of Canada. I hope it's been a useful journey for you. I hope we've managed to spark some things that you will carry with you and maybe even explore more deeply and ruminate on as you expand your skills and gifts as somebody called to leadership in our church. And so in this final input session, I want to ask the question, how do we put together all of the things that we've been talking about in our readings and in our discussions, all the things we've wrestled with? How do we put that together into a package of what it means to be ethical leaders in pastoral ministry in the 21st century in the United Church of Canada? Think about what we've considered this term in this class. What were the surprise moments for you? Was there anything that maybe caused you to think differently about your role in ministry? Now, we'll have an opportunity later to discuss our readings, and I don't want to steal the thunder from that. But I really do think we need to think about how pastoral leadership is different in the 21st century. And how is it different in a COVID-19 world? Like you, I don't know what the future is going to hold, but I have a hunch that even after a vaccine is found, our life as church is going to be profoundly impacted by what's happening in our society. So there are questions, and I think it's really important to divide those questions into technical questions and adaptive questions. Technical questions and adaptive questions. The distinction was made by Ronald Heifetz, one of the most thoughtful writers about leadership today. He says that technical questions lead to action. Adaptive questions lead to learning. Technical questions lead to action. A technical question invites us to find a solution in the toolbox of things we already know or can relatively easily learn. So, for instance, early on in the COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of clergy and congregations learned how to move online on different platforms. Some of them had never done it before. Some of them had dabbled a little, but the information was there. All of a sudden, there was a significant number of really helpful videos that appeared, aiding congregations and clergy who wanted to take worship online. Certainly, it was easier for some than for others. But it was a technical question. The information was out there to be discovered and applied. Adaptive questions lead to learning. In the case of online worship service, the adaptive question might be something like, what does it mean to be church when we cannot physically gather? Another set of distinguishing terms might be problem versus condition. Problem versus condition. A problem we fix, a condition we live with. There are medical problems that can be fixed. Doctors can set a bone or replace an organ. But there are some conditions we simply learn to live with. They can't be fixed or solved. And so consider the adaptive questions that might face your congregation in the 21st century. Often they're unsettling. Often they deny the possibility of easy answers. Our society really likes the people who give comfort. And these questions, these adaptive questions, don't always make us comfortable. They're questions like, how will we be with God? How will we be with one another? Who are we right now? Who are our neighbors? Now, I will admit you can find technical answers to those questions, or at least some of them. And there are lots of experts out there who are prepared to give you a numbered list of the various techniques that you need to apply for achieving something like success in answering those questions. I suggest to you that those answers will only be effective in a very short term, and they're often quite unsatisfying. Another useful set of terms comes from Charles Handy. Charles Handy writes about convergent and divergent problems. Those are like Heifetz's technical and adaptive questions. With convergent problems, the answer is there. We just need to find it. We need to create a conversion between the question or the problem that we have and the solutions that is available. Divergent problems, however, lead to answers that may depend on the circumstances. It may be that there is neither a right nor a wrong answer. Convergent questions lead us to certainty. There is one right answer, and the answer is correct for multiple people. We might even dare to say everyone. Divergent questions receive multiple answers. That takes away our certainty. There may be multiple right answers, and you may need to search for the one that best serves your purpose, which makes taking a solution off the shelf impossible. Change is tough. We talked about change yesterday. Change is tough. For one thing, it's hard to actually know what is changing sometimes and what is not. What is foundational and what is mere novelty in the situation? For instance, think of the change in the way in which we receive news. It's changed from print to digital. And that in and of itself is not a particularly significant change, unless of course you happen to be employed in the newspaper industry. From the point of view of the consumer, I'm still seeking and receiving the news, the same product. But in a digital age, if I have questions about what I read in the newspaper, I'm now in a position to Google it, and in a split second, I can receive thousands of answers. But how do I judge the quality of those answers? What answers are valid for the question I posed? That's the big change. It's not the change in the way we receive the information. The change is that information is no longer filtered by a source I have come to trust, or by one, it's the only one available. If you live in a one newspaper town, that was the source of information. But now, information is all over the place. It's unfiltered, it's unfettered. It can lead to a change in my worldview. And one of the realities in this changing time, is the gap between our aspirations and our reality. This becomes increasingly pressing the more we recognize the limitations of the institutional church that we serve, and how it cannot become the church we believe God is beckoning us to become. We see the institution over here, and it may be filled with people we love, and it may be doing great things, but we have a vision, we have a call from God that's over here. And the gap is a symptom of the gap is the number of leaders and congregations who feel confined to a tiredness. They are so tired. And part of that tiredness is running harder and harder to stay in place without going anywhere. And so we need to be careful about this language of change. Many leaders talk about change, but the change is really only about shifting within the constraints of the existing institution. There's a deeper question, perhaps, that you need to wrestle with your congregation. Think about education. Education can be seen as a series of competing coalitions. Teachers, parents, administrators. It's rarely ever about the students. And money shifts and priorities follow the money, or priorities guide the money. Money shifts depending on which group is strongest within the institution, as each of these groups pursue their own priorities. Now, there's no question in what I'm saying. There's no question about bad behavior or bad attitude. It's all about different priorities. So, despite all of the talk of change in education, what we see is constrained by the institution. And the church is rarely different. We can talk all we like about change, but it's rarely outside the institution. It's rearranging things within the institution, which can be important and useful, but it's not fundamental change. One of the overwhelming realities of church leadership today is that there is no going back. Sometimes people like to talk about, we need to turn the church around. This is not a turnaround time. We can't, I don't care who you are, you can't take us back to a time when the church was at the heart of a culture, a trusted bedrock institution. We are coming out of an aberrant time. An aberrant time. Let me give you one of my favorite examples. In the mid-11th century, a Chicoan First Nations culture emerged and thrived in what is now called New Mexico. The Anasazi indigenous people lived in populous great houses. They developed elaborate irrigation systems to nourish farms. They laid out razor-straight roads. They established lighthouses to send signal messages tremendous distances. They developed a powerful priesthood. They were able to follow and plot stars and planets in a way that was sophisticated beyond their time. It was all unprecedented. It did not last, and it was not repeated. After about 100 years, as quickly as the Anasazi burst on the scene, the culture ebbed. And that cultural ebbing was brought about by two devastating droughts, and by the reality that we had a substantial population living on marginally productive desert landscape. The entire civilization was predicated on a meteorological accident. There was approximately a century of aberrant moisture, aberrant wetness, that allowed this culture to rise up. They were a strong and vital people who could not move forward nor claim a vibrant past because their time of thriving was not the norm. It was an aberration. The point is that what appears to be strength and success can in fact be an aberrant departure from the norm. In North America, the first part of the 20th century and into the time when the church thrived, the first part of that was a time of consolidation and cohesion. What we see is a rapid growth of industrialization and the centralization of society. We see the challenge and response in the Great Depression and World War II, which became consensual national and global missions. In other words, people agreed to work together and to bury their differences for the sake of a larger project. And it was also a time that pushed membership in organizations, including congregations. It was the time of the birth and the early years of the United Church of Canada. Using as a quick example my own parents. My parents, my father would have identified himself, if you asked him who he was, he would have identified himself as a member of a profession, part of a church, a Mason, a member of a golf club. Membership was identity. For my mother, she would have identified herself as a homemaker, a member of the UCW, a member of the Women's Auxiliary of our local hospital. Membership was part of identity. Maybe you can tell a similar story about folk in your family. So that period of consolidation and cohesion was followed by another time characterized by a growing decentralization and deconsolidation the consolidation. It was a pushback, if you like, against uniformity and cohesion, which were themselves unusual in history. And so this was a time of heady progress. There were people in many parts of life who were able to exercise great creativity within the framework of institutions that were open to innovation. They could put their dreams into reality because there was seemingly endless resources, and the institutions which existed were prepared to foster the differences and the innovation. And as long as we as a society could ride both waves, continuing cohesion and growing decentralization, things were grand, at least for the dominant culture. Now, I'm the first to acknowledge that there were many communities that were marginalized in different ways that didn't benefit from this general growth. But I'm thinking of the mainline churches. It was a time of great growth for the churches because there was both the impetus to membership and the place for innovation and newness. But that time has passed. We live in an era where there are multiple sources of influence and guidance for individual lives, where smaller and more unique expressions of community have become the norm, where multiple worldviews and definitions of human good compete, and they find acceptance across what were formerly considered, unbridgeable divides. Now, that can be very exciting, but it's very difficult for leaders. It's not a turnaround time because we can't recapture the culturally aberrant time. One of the phrases that drives me nuts in church meeting after church meeting is, we've got to get people to come back to church. When the reality is that they didn't come to church to begin with. There is no coming back. There is no reconnecting because the institution we expect them to reconnect with is in and of itself unfamiliar. The time when the church thrived, a time when so many participants in the church hearken back to as a golden age, it required an unforeseeable and an uncontrollable conjunction of social, economic, political, and religious vectors that cannot be recreated. So instead of guides that will return us to the easy life of Egypt, we should be calling for leadership that will challenge us to face the new journey, to face problems that will compel us to learn in new ways, problems with no easy answers. In pastoral situations in the 21st century, we face not complicated problems, but complex situations. Our issue is not complicated problems, but complex situations. Think of the break in a game of pool. The first forceful strike of the colored balls with the white ball. There are 16 balls, and though it's simply physical mechanics, it's almost impossible to predict where everything will end up. Increasingly, congregations are confronting complex situations where a series of factors are interacting. Situations where each of those factors might in and of itself be a complicated problem, but which taken together form a complex situation in which resolving a particular complicated problem will not resolve and may even intensify the complexity. Consider the period through which we have just come. At the beginning of Lent 2019, if I had asked you to name the problems your community of faith was facing, you might have been able to do that. The list might have included finances, aging membership, deteriorating facilities. It might have expanded into broader questions of meaning and purpose and mission. As anyone in pastoral leadership knows, each of those is a complicated problem. but it is a problem. In other words, we can analyze the problem and we know that there are resources to fit the solution. Now think of the change from the beginning of Lent 2020 to today. Now, whether the resources are specifically relevant to your particular context and whether the solutions are really operative in your situation is not clear, because your situation in ministry has changed dramatically. That's part of the complication. What turns them into complicated, complex situations is when we start to combine their scope. So, midway through March, we added COVID-19 and the various public health measures. All of a sudden, things moved from being complicated, merely complicated, to more complex. What I mean to say is that there are still complicated problems we could focus on. You could work away at the technical issues of delivering online worship services, whether or not you would do that, what platform you would use, how you could connect people who weren't necessarily online with the online worship. Those are complicated problems. You could find resources that helped you address the very real escalation of a complicated financial problem. How do we deal with the reality that many people, at least in practice, seem to view giving their offering as something they do week by week when they go for the show? While pastoral care became more challenging and complicated, you could figure out resolutions. But the new reality made much more stark the complex situation. What is the role and the place of the church in this new era? How do we live into the new reality? That's not one we can solve with even a quick or a slow solution. It's one we need to live into, because it's going to impact the congregation as a whole, and it's going to impact individuals in wildly unpredictable ways. So COVID-19 is not just a problem for the church. It's a force which has unleashed a condition into which we must live. That may have been a disruptive influence. It's one we certainly didn't ask for, and one which many do not welcome. Having seen it in operation, it may reinforce our inclination to say, intentionally disrupting systems seems counterintuitive when people are already anxious about their future. Intentionally disrupting systems seems counterintuitive when people are already anxious about their future. However, I want to suggest to you that disruptive action is exactly what genuine pastoral leaders need to do in the 21st century. We need courageous leaders who ask intentionally disruptive questions that are essential to the formation of new community. Who are we now? What are we called to do? Who is our neighbor? These are not easy questions. They do not have straightforward solutions. They assume that things are not working, and that what we are doing now is not as faithful and effective as it could be, as God wills it to be, as we feel called to make it be. I would argue that many of our churches are in pain to a greater or lesser degree. What is the source of that pain? Well, I would argue that at least one source, and perhaps a major source of that pain, is a model of a church that arises from an aberrant time and results in a distorted judgment of present-day mission and ministry. Let me give you some for instance. For instance, many of our congregations meet in church buildings that are far too large. And that physical reality reminds them on a weekly basis of what they once were and are no more. They can look around the building and tell you the stories of when it was full and all of the rest of it. And that, without being reframed, leads to the conclusion that they have somehow failed the legacy that was entrusted to them. Many congregations operate with a sense that the best days are behind them, and so somehow the most faithful goal is to recreate what was. But that sense, that model, assumes the aberrant cultural context that simply can't be recreated. Many congregations assume that they have greater significance to the community round about them than they actually do. I've sat through lots of meetings where congregations or congregational members talk about what they need to do to attract those people or why those people are staying away, assuming that what we do is important to those people and not realizing that, in fact, we're utterly irrelevant. It's not that they don't like us, we're not even on their radar. So before they can make an evaluation about us, we have to get on their radar. It's not as if they're choosing not to come to church. Coming to church is not something that they don't even think about. Many congregations still work with the idea that they need to be all things to all people, and that if they can't minister to all people from cradle to the grave, then there's something wrong. We don't have a Sunday school, therefore we are somehow less than complete. We need to think in different ways. Many congregations begin with scarcity, with what is not present, rather than what is present, the abundant grace of God. So in good United Church fashion, we start with a blank piece of newsprint and we talk about the problem and so on, rather than starting with a page listing the many gifts and skills and talents and joys in the congregation and asking the question, where in this is the call to service to God and world? Many congregations still operate with the attitude that they represent a majority, which they don't. And if you look at minority groups, religious and cultural, in Canada, you'll find that they form their lives in very different ways than do majority groups. Faithful pastoral leadership in the 21st century involves helping the organization connect with its realistic pain. What is causing the heart and the soul ache? Now, those are difficult questions. Those are hard questions to approach, but pastoral leadership in the 21st century needs to be willing to wrestle with that question in the confidence that God is leading. God will accompany the congregation on the journey out of the box into the chaos. And the faithful pastoral leader needs to help support the learning and reordering that follows when we ask those questions on the way to capturing a faithful possibility. What do I mean by realistic pain? Realistic pain is the awareness of an unacceptable disequilibrium or a significant discrepancy between the ways things are and the way things could be. There's an unacceptable disequilibrium, or another way of phrasing it is there's a significant discrepancy between the ways things are and the way things could be. And this orientation to leadership requires fostering certain qualities. And I have to confess, I'm not sure we've done a great job of fostering these. We need a deeply positive regard and expectation for the capacity of peoples and groups in the congregation because they are God's people in this place. One of my fundamental theological convictions is that God provides for God's people everything we need to do God's will and God's call in this time. But sometimes the discrepancy arises because what we're doing is not following God's call. We're trying to fit into another model of church. We need leaders that have a moderate degree of assertiveness and decisiveness, blended with a high degree of collaborative interest in others. We need people who are able to draw out from, and congregations that are really to give out the elements that come to a creative and faithful solution. We need to work with and anticipate conflict. We can't always make nice. Sometimes we have to even foster conflict and let it be out there for a time. We need creativity that is vigorous yet well managed and grounded. And if you're not the creative person, and I don't see myself as being a particularly creative person, you need to have the ideas and the capacity to draw that creativity out of others, manage it, and keep it grounded. We need to continually be enhancing our ways to think theologically about situations, moving towards transformational action. We need to be much more effective than we traditionally have been in terms of the networks of influence in the congregation and the communities. We need clearer sources, clearer processes of consistently communicating and gathering feedback. In 2014, David Gortner authored a major study for the Virginia Theological Seminary entitled Clergy Leadership for the 21st Century. Are we up to the task? The research group dug deep into the qualities of clergy, graduates of Virginia Theological Seminary and others, to try and determine the sorts of skills and characteristics the seminary should be aiming for if it was to produce graduates who would serve as faithful leaders in God's church in this time. Some of their findings are interesting to us. A large percentage of the ministers were what they called placeholder clergy. They were basically competent in the core functions of ministry, preaching, worship leadership, and pastoral care. Some of them were called talented but not tenuous. Some of their findings are interesting to us. A large percentage of ministers were what they called placeholder clergy. They were basically competent in the core functions of ministry, preaching, worship leadership, pastoral care. Some of them were talented but tenuous. They were highly creative, but they lacked the something that would bring their wonderful ideas to fruition. Some of them were kind, helpful, dedicated, full of visions of what the church could be. Clergy are too often conflict averse, unclear about human systems and organizations. And denominations as systems seek out people with these patterns, or we shape people into these patterns to fit them in. So Gortner concluded by asking his colleagues, in what areas are we or are we not strengthening clergy capacities and therefore increasing confidence and decisiveness and assertiveness? In what areas are we or are we not strengthening the capacities that will help clergy to move beyond maintenance into deeper and broader leadership for transformational change in the church? And so, as you evolve as leaders in God's United Church in the 21st century, I invite you to think about how you are going to enhance your capacity for confidence and decisiveness and to assert a vision. How will you become leaders who can take us into that next phase? And you may discover that the leadership skills that you need are not found within the institution. Maybe they are. But maybe you need to go and, shall we say, sit at the feet of people who do other things, who perhaps maybe they're entrepreneurs, perhaps maybe they are creative thinkers, out-of-the-box writers, the folk who are on the cutting edge, and maybe we need to go and hang out with them and learn the ways in which we take all of those core theological skills and learning which are so crucial to the church today. I would argue that the church needs leaders who are even more deeply steeped in the traditions and the story of the church, because we have so many people who don't know that story. And if we are going to be that minority who work towards the world that God sees coming, then we need to know who we are, and we have leaders who can firmly ground us in that. But we also need leaders who can help us see what it looks like to live beyond what that has meant in the past and into God's future. That's the sort of leadership growth and learning that I would encourage you to take on. And know that you are valued to God as you are, and that your leadership is so tremendously important. And may you know grace and peace in your journey with God and God's people.